There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who have decided, collectively and without ceremony, that you do not matter. Nara Ashvale had lived inside that loneliness for so long that she had stopped noticing its edges. It had become the walls of every room she entered, the temperature of every meal she ate in silence at the far end of the communal table, the weight of every glance that passed over her, as though she were made of air rather than flesh and bone and quiet, furious longing. She was 24 years old, and she had never once been looked at the way the other women of Clan Ashvale were looked at. Not with desire, not with respect, not even with the particular contempt that is reserved for people who are considered dangerous. She was simply not seen, and in a world built on power and the visible animal display of it, invisibility was its own slow death. The clan's territory stretched across the northern highlands of what outsiders called the Veyroth Range, a series of mountain ridges so old that the stone had turned silver at the peaks, catching the moonlight in ways that made the humans in the valleys below write poems about ghosts. The Ashvale held 3 of those ridges, and the dense forest corridors between them, a territory earned through centuries of dominance and maintained through the kind of hierarchical discipline that left no room for sentiment. At the top sat the alpha pair, Lord Devran Ashvale and his mate Sura, who governed with the cold precision of people who had confused efficiency for wisdom so long ago that they could no longer tell the difference. Below them, the ranked wolves moved through their days in strict accordance with their position, each one knowing exactly where they stood, exactly what they were owed, and what they owed in return. It was a system that worked beautifully, as long as you had something to offer it. Nara had been born without a wolf. This was not a common thing. It happened perhaps once in several generations across all the clans combined, a genetic anomaly so rare that the old texts had different names for it depending on the era in which they were written. The hollow-born, the skinless, the moon-past. In the current age, the polite term was dormant, which was simply a kinder way of saying broken. She could not shift. She could not feel the pull of the pack bond the way the others described it. That warm, constant hum of connection that linked every wolf in the clan to every other, a living web of shared awareness. She stood outside of it, pressing her face against a window she could not open, watching a warmth she could not enter. Her parents had died when she was 7, a territorial dispute with a neighboring clan that had turned violent at the border, and after that she had been raised in the communal wards with the other orphan children, except that the other orphan children had eventually come in too, their wolves, and been absorbed into the social fabric of the clan, and Nara had simply remained where she was, unremarkable and unincorporated, a loose thread that no one had bothered to cut away. What she had instead of a wolf was her mind, and she had used it the way a person uses a weapon when it is the only one available to them. She had learned to read at 4, which was early even for a clan that valued the recording of history. By 8, she had memorized the complete genealogical records of the Ashvale line going back 11 generations. By 12, she had taught herself the secondary lunar dialect used in interclan treaties, a language so archaic that the clan's official scribe, a dour man named Helvik, who treated knowledge as personal property, had nearly choked on his own surprise when she'd corrected his translation of a boundary agreement during a formal council session. He had not forgiven her for it. He had, however, stopped locking the archive room when he left, because the alternative was admitting that she had already copied down everything worth copying, and his locks were serving no purpose. By the time Nara was 17, she could read 4 variants of the old lunar script, including the 3rd archaic form that had not been in active use since before the Shattering, the catastrophic magical event 800 years ago that had ended the age of the Great Pacts and left the world divided into the smaller, weaker clans that now clung to their territories. Like survivors clinging to wreckage, she had found those texts in the deepest section of the Ashvale archive, stored in a sealed chest that had probably not been opened in 200 years, the leather binding gone soft with age, the pages made of something that was not quite parchment, something that seemed to hold the faint, residual warmth of whatever magic had been pressed into it at the moment of its creation. She had read them slowly, carefully, with the particular reverence she reserved for things that had survived longer than anyone expected them to. And it was in those texts, in the cramped and precise hand of a scribe who had been dead for 8 centuries, that she first encountered the name Cale Voss. He was described in the third archaic texts not as a villain, which was how the modern histories framed him, but as the first of the primordials, the original line of alpha wolves whose power had not been merely physical or hierarchical, but elemental, woven into the fabric of the world's magic itself. The primordials had not simply led their packs. They had been the axis around which the pack's entire existence turned, their wolves vast and white and luminous, capable of things that the modern clans could barely conceptualize, let alone replicate. And Cale Voss had been the first and the greatest of them, the alpha of alphas, the one the old text called the White Wolf, with a weight and reverence that made Nara's chest ache even centuries removed from whatever truth that title had once carried. The official history said he had been sealed 800 years ago for betraying his people, for allying with a faction of dark practitioners who had sought to use his power to tear the boundary between the living world and the realm of pure magic, an act that would have unmade the physical world entirely. The Ashvale histories described his sealing as a heroic act of collective sacrifice, the other alpha lines and their councils coming together to imprison a monster before the damage became irreversible. It was a clean story. It had the satisfying shape of a morality tale. Nara had believed it for years, the way she had believed most of the things she had been told, with the uncritical acceptance of someone who had no particular reason to expect she was being lied to about history. Then she had found the secondary texts, the ones written not in the official hand of sanctioned historians, but in the cramped, hurried script of someone writing quickly, writing in fear, writing things down because they were terrified they would otherwise be lost. Those texts told a different story. They said Cale Voss had not betrayed his people. He had tried to expose the betrayal of others, specifically of the 5 council heads who had been siphoning power from the primordial bloodlines for decades, slowly and carefully, using methods so subtle that most of the primordials themselves had not noticed the drain. He had found evidence. He had brought it before the assembled clans, and the council heads, facing exposure and the destruction of everything they had built, had done what people with power always do when truth becomes inconvenient. They had turned the story inside out and buried the truth so deep beneath the official version that within a generation, no one remembered that any other version had existed. The seal that held Cale Voss was not a prison built to contain a monster. It was a silencing. It was 800 years of making sure one man could never speak again. Nara had sat with that knowledge for 7 years, carrying it the way she carried everything that mattered to her, quietly, internally, with no one to tell, because there was no one who would listen. She had not yet understood what it meant for her personally. She had not yet understood that the bloodline capable of breaking the seal, the one the secondary texts described in careful, almost reverent detail, was not some long-extinct line from the ancient world. It had simply been scattered and diluted and forgotten, the way inconvenient things tend to be when powerful people have a vested interest in ensuring they remain forgotten. She would learn all of this later. But first, there was the expedition. If you're already feeling the pull of this story, do yourself a favor and hit that like button before we go any further, because what happens next in that sealed chamber is the kind of moment that will make you want to watch this from the very beginning again, once you know how it ends. The Ashvale clan had received the summons from the Supreme Council 6 weeks before the expedition was organized. Nara had not been in the room when Lord Devrin read it aloud to his inner circle, but she had been in the adjacent records room, which shared a wall thin enough that sound carried clearly if you happened to be standing at the right shelf, which she was, cataloging a set of territorial maps that did not strictly require her attention at that particular moment. The council's summons described the location of the White Wolf's chamber, deep in the contested territory at the northern edge of the Veyrath Range, and proposed a joint operation between several clans to access the chamber and extract the residual primordial power stored within it for redistribution. That word, redistribution, had made something cold move through Nara's chest, because she knew enough about how power worked in the old magical sense to understand that you could not simply extract it from a sealed chamber and redistribute it like grain from a storehouse. Power of that magnitude was not an object. It was a living thing, and living things did not survive extraction. What the council was proposing was not redistribution. It was consumption. They intended to drain whatever remained of the primordial power that had been sealed inside that chamber 800 years ago, divide it among the 5 remaining council families, and call it a restoration of balance. It was. Nara understood with a clarity that surprised her with its sharpness, the exact same crime that Cale Voss had tried to expose. The council families were still doing it. They had simply been waiting, for 8 centuries, until the man who might stop them was safely contained, and the knowledge of what they were doing had faded far enough from living memory that no one would recognize the pattern. She had pressed her back against the shelf and breathed carefully, listening to Lord Devon discuss the logistics with his inner circle, and she had understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that she needed to be part of this expedition, not because she had any power to stop what the council intended, but because the chamber would have documentation, the kind of documentation that only existed in places sealed by old magic, and if she could access it and preserve it, there might eventually be a record of the truth that was harder to bury than the ones that came before. The second thing she understood was that getting herself included in the expedition would require a careful application of her own particular brand of invisibility, because Lord Devon would never willingly bring her, but he would also never notice her absence from the party if she was inserted into the logistics quietly enough. It took her 4 days to manage it. She went to Helvik, who hated her, but also owed her a debt he had never acknowledged aloud, a matter of a translation error in a treaty. Negotiation 3 years ago that she had quietly corrected before it reached the signing table, and saved him from an embarrassment that would have cost him his position. She reminded him of this debt with her characteristic lack of drama, simply noting that the expedition would require a reader of 3rd archaic script, and that she was the only person in the clan who qualified. Helvik had looked at her with an expression that combined loathing with reluctant practicality, and he had added her name to the expedition roster in the auxiliary capacity of archival interpreter, a role so low status that no one in the inner circle bothered to look at it. The expedition party numbered 14. There were 8 warriors from the Ashvale's ranked fighters, led by a broad-shouldered beta named Corvin, who had the particular combination of physical confidence and intellectual incuriosity that Nara had come to recognize as common in men who had never been asked to question anything. There were 3 representatives from other clans, all higher-ranked wolves sent to observe on behalf of their respective council family connections. There was a council liaison named Maren, a woman of about 40 with careful eyes and very still hands, who made Nara instinctively alert, without being able to articulate why. There was Helvik, who had decided at the last moment that he needed to be present personally, which meant that he had realized the expedition had more value than he had initially assessed, and did not intend to let someone else claim it. And there was Nara, listed last, described as auxiliary, carrying a pack that weighed almost as much as she did because she had filled it with every document she thought might be relevant, and also with the small, careful tools of her trade, the preservation cloths, the copying materials, the 2 lanterns with the stable flame that didn't flicker in wind. They traveled for 9 days through increasingly difficult terrain. The further north they moved, the older the world felt, the trees giving way to a kind of sparse, ancient growth that Nara recognized from the old texts as the Edge Forest, the zone where the boundary between the physical world and the deeper layers of old magic grew thin. The wolves in the party became restless in a way they tried to hide and mostly failed, the kind of animal unease that belongs to creatures who can feel things their conscious minds haven't processed yet. Nara did not experience this unease, or rather she experienced a version of it that felt different from theirs. Not animal warning, but something more like recognition. The feeling of approaching something she had been reading about for so long that arriving at it felt less like discovery and more like return. The chamber was not what any of them had expected, or rather, it was not what the warriors and the council representatives had expected. It was exactly what Nara had imagined. It was a structure that predated anything the modern. Clans had built, set into the face of a cliff so old that the stone had grown a kind of luminescence. Not bright, but steady. The faint silver-white glow of something that had been touched by magic so long ago that the magic had become part of the material itself. The entrance was marked in Third Archaic script, and when Marin the council liaison gestured imperiously for Nara to translate the inscription above the arch, Nara read it aloud in a careful, neutral voice, saying only what the official text said. Here lies the sealed, the silenced, the one who waited. She did not translate the second inscription, the smaller one carved into the stone at ankle height, which said in the cramped, hurried script of the frightened secondary author, "He told the truth, and they buried him in it. The blood that opens this door is the blood that was owed to him. Do not let them use what is here against him again." She did not translate that one, because Marin was watching her with those very still hands and very careful eyes, and Nara had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any situation is the moment when the person who has been discounted becomes suddenly legible to the person who discounted them. Now, if you're the kind of person who stops a story at exactly the moment it becomes unbearable not to know what happens next, this is that moment. Stay with me. The entrance of the chamber required a key that was not a physical object, but a resonance, a particular combination of intent and bloodline that the old magic had been designed to recognize. The council had believed this key to be the collective presence of multiple high-ranked wolves, which was why they had sent representatives from several clans. Marin had explained this theory in the careful, authoritative tone of someone repeating something they had been told by people with impressive credentials, and the assembled wolves had pressed forward at the chamber entrance in a display of concentrated pack energy that was genuinely impressive and entirely ineffective. The stone did not respond. The glow did not change. The entrance remained closed. Corvin, whose approach to problems that did not yield to force was to apply more force, suggested they try a direct assault on the stone. Marin overruled him with the particular weariness of a person who has spent years managing men who believe the solution to a locked door is a larger hammer. The council representatives conferred. Helvik stood to one side, looking the way he always looked when he was recalculating his position relative to unfolding events. And Nara stood at the back of the group, reading the secondary inscription again, understanding something that settled into her chest like a stone into still water. Quiet, complete, impossible to undo. She stepped forward. No one noticed, because no one was watching her, which had always been the precise mechanism by which she moved through the world. She placed her hand flat against the stone of the entrance, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just the way she did most things, quietly, without announcement, because there was no one to announce herself to, and the stone responded. The glow changed immediately, shifting from its steady silver white to something warmer, deeper, the color of moonlight filtered through very old glass. A sound moved through the chamber entrance, not a sound that could be heard with ears exactly, but a sound that could be felt in the sternum, in the place where something was supposed to live, that Nara had always believed was simply absent in her. It moved through her like a bell being struck, and the vibration expanding outward, and the entrance opened, the stone drawing back in a motion that was unhurried and inevitable, the way very old things move when they finally decide to move. Corvin and the warriors went in first, because that was the established order of things, and Nara followed at the back with Marin and Helvik, and for a moment she thought perhaps nothing exceptional was going to happen. Perhaps the opening of the door was simply a mechanical response to a specific bloodline trigger, and the chamber inside would be an empty room with some documents and a depleted magical residue that the council could extract without incident. She thought this for approximately the duration of the time it took to walk from the entrance to the interior of the first antechamber, which was about 40 steps. Then the floor lit up. The illumination came from beneath the stone itself, the same channel and vein pattern that she had seen described in the Third Archaic texts as the living map of a primordials-bound territory, a magical cartography of everything that had once fallen within Kael Voss's reach. It should have been dormant, It had been sealed for 800 years. It lit up the moment Nara crossed the threshold, every channel blazing to life in sequence, a cascade of cold silver fire that moved outward from her feet in all directions and did not stop at the walls. The warriors stumbled back. One of the council representatives made a sound that was not quite a word. Marin went very still in a way that was different from her usual stillness, the kind of stillness that belongs to someone recalculating something important very rapidly. Helvig said nothing, which was unusual, and Nara filed it away without looking at him. She walked forward, because the floor was showing her where to go, and the part of her that had been reading these texts for 7 years recognized the pattern, and the part of her that had been invisible for 24 years had nothing to lose by following it. The path led through the antechamber and into a second, larger space, a circular room with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow and walls, covered entirely in the kind of inscriptions that would take her months to fully read, and at the center of the room there was a dais of the same silver-lit stone, and on the dais there was a figure. He was not, as the legend described, a monster. He was a man. He was tall even in the position he occupied, which was not lying down but seated upright, as if even in 8 centuries of enforced stillness, he had refused to give whoever sealed him the satisfaction of seeing him prostrate. His hair was white, which the old texts had described as the physical manifestation of the primordial connection, the mark of a wolf whose bond with the moon magic was so complete that it had worked its way into his physical form. His face was sharp and spare, the face of someone who had been genuinely beautiful once, and had been worn by time and circumstances into something that was not beautiful in any soft sense, but was impossible to look away from. His hands rested on his knees, with a deliberateness that suggested the position had been chosen rather than fallen into. He looked like a man who had been waiting, with terrible patience, for someone worth waking up for. The seal that held him was visible, a network of dark lines laid over his skin like a second skeleton, pulsing slowly with the same rhythm as a heartbeat, but wrong, suppressed, the rhythm of something being held under rather than allowed to beat freely. Nara had read descriptions of this kind of seal in the third archaic texts. She had understood it academically, as a technique, as a historical artifact. Standing in front of it, she understood it in her body instead, as a violence, as the shape that 800 years of enforced silence leaves on a person. She took another step forward, and his eyes opened. They were silver, not the pale gray that people sometimes describe as silver. Actually silver, the color of the glow in the walls and the floor, the color of something that held old magic in it and had never let it go. They moved immediately, directly to her, with the kind of focus that belongs to a person who has been in darkness for a very long time and has learned to use every available signal at once. He looked at her face, and then at her hands, and then at the floor around her, where the light was still blazing outward from her footsteps. And something changed in his expression. Not shock exactly, because she had the sense that he had known something like this was possible, had perhaps believed in it for 800 years the way you believe in something when it is the only thing keeping you from despair. It was more like confirmation, like recognition. His mouth moved. No sound came out. She understood, from the texts, that the seal had included a silencing, the same silencing it had been designed to enact permanently. He could not speak. Not yet. Not until the seal was further loosened. She said, in Third Archaic, the only language she was confident he would know without confusion, I know what they did to you. I've been reading about it for 7 years. I'm sorry it took this long. Something moved across his face that she could not name and did not try to. He held her gaze for a long moment in which she was aware, peripherally, of the sounds of the warriors and the council representatives and Marin entering the outer antechamber behind her, and then he lifted one hand from his knee, the first movement he had made in 8 centuries, and he turned it palm upward on his knee, not reaching for her, not demanding anything, simply offering the shape of an open hand as a kind of statement that whatever she was, whatever she had come here for, he was not her enemy. She stepped up onto the dais. Behind her, Corvin shouted something that she didn't process as words, just as noise. The noise of the established order of things encountering something it had not accounted for. Maren said her name once, in a tone that was very controlled and therefore very alarming. Nara ignored both of them, because she was reading the seal, tracing its lines with her eyes the way she had traced every document she had ever worked with, slowly, systematically, looking for the logic underneath the construction. And the logic was there, visible to her in a way that she suspected it would not be visible to anyone else. Not because she was uniquely gifted in magic, but because the seal had been designed specifically to be undone by the bloodline it had wronged, and her blood was apparently that bloodline, and the seal was showing her, like a text revealing its own annotations, exactly where its structure could be questioned. She placed 2 fingers against the first node, a convergence point on the back of his left hand, and she did not use power, because she had no power in the sense that the others in the room understood power. She used something else, something that felt, from the inside, like the precise application of the same quality she had used to survive 24 years of being dismissed, the refusal to accept that the story she had been told about herself was the true one. The first node cracked. It did not explode, did not flare dramatically. It simply separated along a line that had always been there, waiting for someone who could see it, and the seal's rhythm changed, the suppressed heartbeat shifting toward something less wrong, and the man on the dais drew a breath that was audible in the silence of the chamber, a breath that had the quality of a person surfacing from very deep water, raw and necessary and enormous. He spoke one word. It came out roughened and strange, the voice of something that had not been used in 8 centuries, but clear. He said, in Third Archaic, the word that meant both the name of a person and the recognition of them, the word that in that language carried the specific weight of, I see you, I know you, you are real. He said it with his silver eyes fixed on her face, and his open hand still resting on his knee. And the word he used was the 3rd archaic root of a name that had not been spoken aloud in 800 years. And it was her name. Or rather, it was the name of the bloodline she had been carrying without knowing it, the name of the people to whom the seal owed a debt. Nara did not cry. She was not, by temperament or by history, a person who cried easily, but her hands shook once, briefly, and she allowed them to before she steadied them and turned around to face the room. Behind her, Maren had gone from controlled to calculating, those very still hands now clasped in front of her body in the posture of someone making a rapid decision. The council representatives were backing toward the antechamber. The warriors looked to Corvin, who looked to Maren, in the chain of command reflex that Nara had observed her entire life and found in this moment deeply clarifying in terms of who was actually running this expedition. Helvik was watching her with an expression she had never seen from him before, not resentment or reluctant obligation, but something that looked, oddly, like the fulfillment of a long expectation. The chamber is responding to her, Maren said, not to anyone in particular, the way a person states an observation they need to hear aloud in order to think clearly about it. The primordial bloodline we thought was extinct. Clearly not, Nara said. The council will need to be informed. I'm certain they will. She kept her voice even. And while you do that, I'm going to continue working on the seal. Corvin took a step toward the dais. The man behind Nara moved, not standing. Not yet capable of that, but straightening with a shift of weight and intention that filled the room the way a change in air pressure fills a room. That quality of a large and very old thing waking up and orienting itself and making its orientation known. Corvin stopped. I'd suggest, Nara said, still in the same even tone, that everyone take the time they need to think carefully about what they want to do next. The options are more limited than they were an hour ago. This is the part where most stories would have Nara deliver a speech. She didn't. She turned back to the dais and kept working. Go ahead and drop a comment right now telling me what you thought when the chamber floor lit up, because I genuinely want to know if you saw that coming. And also because your engagement is what keeps this channel alive and lets me keep bringing you stories like this one. She worked for 3 hours, identifying and separating the seal's nodes one by one. And during those 3 hours, several things happened in the chamber, around her, that she was aware of, but did not permit to interrupt her focus. Marin sent 2 of the council representatives back through the entrance, presumably to send communication to the Supreme Council. Corvin positioned his warriors in a loose perimeter that was clearly designed to look like protective formation, but functioned as containment. Though whether the containment was for her, for the man on the dais, or for the situation in general, was not entirely clear. Helvik sat down on a piece of fallen stone near the antechamber entrance and opened a small notebook and began writing, steadily and without apparent emotion, which Nara interpreted as his decision about what role he was going to play in the version of events that was now unfolding. The man on the dais watched her work. He did not speak again after that first word. Not because the seal was reimposing silence. She had already separated that node. But because he was observing, and she understood from the quality of his attention. That observation was something he took seriously. That 800 years of enforced stillness had made him extremely good at watching and understanding what he was watching. Occasionally she would encounter a node structure she didn't immediately recognize, a configuration that wasn't in the text she had memorized, and she would pause, studying it from several angles, and when she looked up to think she would sometimes find him looking at the same node. And once, just once, he pointed, a brief and specific gesture toward a stress line she hadn't noticed, and she followed the gesture and found what he was indicating and understood it. And she nodded and he nodded, and they went back to their respective tasks. This was how their first 3 hours together passed, in the mutual, wordless, intensely practical work of undoing something that should never have been done. It was not, by most romantic standards, a beginning. By the standards of people who have been alone in the ways that Nara and Kyle Voss had each been alone, it was an enormous beginning. By the end of the 3rd hour, she had separated 16 of the seal's 22 primary nodes and all 12 of its secondary binding points. The change in him was visible. He was more present, more physically anchored, the silver light in his eyes steadier and warmer than it had been at the start. The seal's lines were still visible on his skin, but no longer pulsing with that wrong, suppressed rhythm. He was breathing freely. His color was better, which was a strange thing to notice about a person who had been magically sealed for 8 centuries. But the physical changes were real and progressive, and Nara catalogued them with the same attention she gave everything she studied. When she paused to rest her hands, which had begun to ache with a sensation that was not pain exactly, but the deep fatigue of sustained, precise work, he said, in Third Archaic, "You have been reading the secondary texts." "Since I was 17, she said. "The council families have been looking for them for 200 years. They've been looking in the wrong places. The archive rooms of mid-tier clans are not where they think to look." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but had the shape of one. "No," he said. "I imagine not. They're planning to drain whatever power remains in this chamber and divide it among themselves," she said, because she had no interest in performing. The kind of delicate conversational approach that would eventually arrive at this point. She had too much to say, and too little certainty about how much uninterrupted time she had to say it. That is what this expedition was actually for. Not historical access, not scholarship. They want the residual primordial energy that was sealed here with you. He was quiet for a moment. How much do you know about what that would do? Based on what the texts describe, consuming concentrated primordial, energy that has been sealed and compressed for 8 centuries, would not simply augment the recipient. It would alter them fundamentally, and not in a way that leaves the recipient in control of the alteration. The power would metabolize the person, rather than the other way around. "That is correct," he said. "They know this, or some of them do. Marin certainly does." Nara glanced toward the antechamber, where Marin was no longer visible, having withdrawn at some point during the last hour. "She's made contact with the council," Nara said. Yes. He had, in the last hour, moved from the upright seated position to something slightly less formal, not comfortable exactly, because comfort was probably a long way away, but less like a person proving a point. "They will send more people with different mandates than the ones given to this party." Killers, Nara said. Yes. How much time do we have? He thought about this with the deliberate quality of someone who had never been casual about estimating time. 3 days before the nearest contingent could arrive, if the council moves immediately, which it will. Perhaps 4 if the communication route has complications. Then I have 3 days to finish the seal work. She flexed her hands, assessing the fatigue. I can do it in 2 if I understand the remaining nodes. I can help you understand them. This was, she realized later, the first offer anyone had made to help her with anything in a very long time. Not because they wanted something from her, not as a transaction or a calculation, but because she needed assistance, and he was capable of providing it, and he saw no reason not to. She accepted it the way she accepted everything that was given without strings, with quiet, complete attention. Tell me about the 7th tier nodes, she said. The texts I have are incomplete about them, and he told her, and she listened, and the work continued. There was a moment, late in the first night, when the chamber was quiet, except for the sound of the warriors settling into sleep shifts and the distant sound of Helvik still writing in his notebook, when Kale Voss said, without preamble, "You are not what they described in the summons." What did the summons describe? She asked, not looking up from the node she was examining. A bloodline key. A tool. She nodded, unsurprised. That is what I was sent as. That is not what you are. She looked up then, because there was something in the way he said it that was not a compliment in the way compliments are usually deployed, as social currency or persuasion, but a statement of observed fact, delivered with the same directness she had been applying to everything in this chamber. He was looking at her with the full, steady force of 800 years of learned patience, and she held the look, which was not easy, but was necessary, the way a lot of necessary things were not easy. I'm the last of a bloodline that was suppressed specifically to prevent this moment from happening, she said. I was raised in a mid-tier clan as a dormant, treated as a burden, pointed at this chamber as a disposable key because no one alive knew what I actually was. The secondary texts were hidden because they contained information about the bloodline. I found them because I was a child with no social standing and unlimited access to an archive that no one considered worth protecting. She paused. I'm not sure whether that's tragedy or comedy. Perhaps both, he said. In my experience, the two are less distinct than people prefer. She almost laughed. And then she did laugh quietly, which surprised her enough that she noted it the way she noted things she wanted to examine later, in the patient, methodical way she approached everything that mattered. You've been sealed for 800 years, she said. Yes. How much of that time were you aware? All of it, he said. And the weight of those 2 words was not self-pity, not performance, just the plain and terrible weight of the thing itself. The seal prevented action. It did not prevent awareness. She held that for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. You said that already. It seemed worth saying again. He was quiet for a moment. The person who sealed me, he said carefully, included a provision in the magic that would allow him to speak to me periodically. He did this for about 200 years, and then he stopped. And I do not know whether it was because he died or because he found it insufficiently satisfying. His voice was steady. For the last 600 years, I have had no external input. I have had my memory, and the feeling of the magic around me, and occasionally the sound of people arriving at the outer chamber and leaving without entering. And I have had the knowledge of what I found, and what was done to me because of it, which has had a great deal of time in which to become very clear. What do you intend to do? She asked. When the seal is fully removed, ensure that what I found 800 years ago reaches people who can act on it. He looked at her steadily, and ensure that the council families do not get to consume this chamber. Those are the same goal, she said. Yes, I had already come to the same conclusion, she said. I brought copies of the secondary texts and additional materials I've compiled over 7 years. If we can get them to enough independent parties before the council can suppress them, the information becomes impossible to bury again. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that she would think about later, in the days that followed, when she had time to think about things that weren't immediate problems. It was the expression of someone encountering, after a very long time, evidence that the world had not entirely failed to produce what it was supposed to produce. "You came here as a tool," he said, "and you brought everything necessary to make it irreversible." "I came here as a tool," she agreed, "because no one was going to invite me to come as anything else." This is the point in the story where you should absolutely subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because I promise you that what Nara and Kale do in the next 48 hours is the kind of story that will live in your head for a long time, and you do not want to miss what comes next. The second day in the chamber was the day things became dangerous in a way that moved beyond the abstract and into the immediate. Corvin had been receiving communications via the small, rune-etched signal stones that the warriors carried for interclan contact, and his manner had been changing incrementally since the previous afternoon, in ways that Nara had been monitoring with peripheral attention, while keeping her main focus on the seal work. He was becoming less a soldier following ambiguous orders, and more a soldier with specific ones. By mid-morning of the second day, his eyes had the particular quality of a person who has been told what to do, and is now organizing himself to do it. And what he had been told to do, Nara deduced from the geometry of his warrior's positioning, was to prevent both her and the figure on the dais from leaving the chamber. Kale had noticed this at approximately the same time she had. He said nothing about it directly, but his attention had shifted, covering the room in the comprehensive, strategic way of someone reassessing the tactical situation. And she found herself grateful, in a way that was practical rather than sentimental, that 800 years of enforced stillness had apparently produced not despair and deterioration, but something more like a very, very long time to think. "They're not going to let us complete the work and walk out," she said quietly, not looking up from the 15th node, which was the most complex she had encountered, a layered structure that had required 3 separate conversations with Kyle to fully map. "No," he said, equally quiet. "The order will be to contain us and wait for the team the council is sending." "How much stronger will you be when the seal is fully removed?" "Significantly," he said, with the directness that she had come to expect from him. No false modesty, no performance of humility that wasn't real. "The power that was sealed has been building pressure for 8 centuries. It won't be immediately controllable. I will need time after the removal before I am fully coherent." "How much time?" "Hours. Perhaps half a day." She looked up at him. "I need to finish the seal work, and then we need to be in a position to move before the council's team arrives. That means I need to finish before Corvin decides to act, and Corvin is going to decide to act before nightfall." "He's been given a deadline," Kale said. "Yes." She looked back at the node. The 16th node is the last barrier on the vocal and cognitive seals. Everything after that is purely physical. Binding. If I clear 16, you will have full access to your judgment and your communication capacity, but not yet full physical freedom. Correct? Correct. And if I clear the remaining 6 nodes consecutively after that without a break, the physical binding will release. But as I said, the power displacement will require adjustment time. I will not be dangerous to you," he added, and she recognized the distinction he was drawing. The specific reassurance that what he was warning her about was about control of his own capacity, not about intent. "But I will not be reliable as an active force for several hours." "Then Helvik needs to be the active force," she said. A pause. "The scribe. He has been writing for 2 days straight," she said. "He is not documenting the expedition. He's been writing too fast and too consistently for that. He's copying something. The only thing worth copying in this chamber, from his perspective, is the wall inscriptions." She glanced at Helvik, who appeared to be completely absorbed in his notebook. "He has been building a parallel record. I have been watching him do it. I owed him a debt, and I made him think I was calling it in to get myself on the expedition. I was not calling it in. I was giving him a reason to be here that would make sense to him, because I needed him to see this with his own eyes, and I needed him to make a copy of what is on these walls." Kyle was quiet for a moment. You anticipated this. Not specifically, she said. I anticipated that if I found what I was looking for, I would need more documentation than I could produce alone. Helvik is meticulous, and he understands the value of primary sources in a way that most people in our clan do not. She paused. He also, I think, has suspected for a very long time that the official history was wrong. He has too good a scholar's instincts not to have noticed the inconsistencies. He needed a catalyst. You were the catalyst. I was. The opportunity, she said. There is a difference. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the quality of that exchange was different from anything she had experienced before. Not because it was warm, not because it was romantic in any conventional sense, but because it was the look of two people who had each spent an extraordinary amount of time being profoundly underestimated, recognizing that in each other with perfect clarity. Clear the 16th node, he said. I will handle. Corvin, you can't yet. I don't need to be able to move, he said. I need to be able to speak. She cleared the 16th node. The change in the room was immediate, and visible even to people who didn't understand the seal architecture. The residual pressure of 8 centuries of suppressed voice releasing was not a sound exactly, but something felt in the chest, a frequency shift, like the moment after a very loud noise when the air hasn't quite settled. Every wolf in the room reacted with animal instinct, the warriors flinching and repositioning, Corvin's head coming up with sharp attention. And Kale Voss, for the first time in 800 years, spoke at full voice. He did not shout. He did not need to. The voice itself carried the weight of a primordial speaking without restraint, a quality that was not volume but presence, the kind of sound that fills the architecture of your nervous system before it reaches your ears. He spoke in the modern common tongue, which he had apparently been listening to for decades through whatever the seal had allowed him to perceive, and what he said was neither a command nor a threat. He told the truth. He simply began to speak the truth, in the complete and specific detail that 800 years of having nothing else to do had made absolutely precise. And the truth was about the council families, and about what they had done before they sealed him, and about what they were doing now. And it was structured with the clarity of someone who had arranged it and rearranged it in the silence of centuries, until every fact was in its exact right place. Corvin stood frozen. The warrior stood frozen. Helvik's pen had stopped moving, and he was listening with his whole body. And then it started moving again, faster than before. Nara started on the 17th node. She cleared the last 6 nodes in the remaining hours of the afternoon, working through the 17th and 18th and 19th while Kyle continued to speak. To the room, maintaining the truth-telling with the consistency of someone who had been waiting 8 centuries for the opportunity and was not going to waste a moment of it now that it had arrived. By the time she reached the 20th node, 2 of the 3 warriors had sat down, not in deference or surrender, but in the particular posture of people whose understanding of the situation has been so fundamentally reorganized that the physical posture of readiness no longer makes sense. Corvan was still standing, but his expression had moved from a soldier following orders to a man who no longer knows which orders he is supposed to be following, which was a different and more interesting situation. The 21st node was the deepest physical binding, the one that held the seal anchored to the dais itself, and it was also the most complex structure she had encountered, a configuration that even Kale's guidance hadn't fully prepared her for, and she spent 40 minutes on it. Patient and systematic, unwinding it the way she unwound any problem, by finding the underlying logic and following it, rather than trying to impose her own. When it finally separated, a shudder went through the dais, and through the man on it, and she placed one hand on his forearm without thinking, steadying, and felt the change in the quality of his stillness, the transition from held in place to simply still, the difference between restraint and rest. The 22nd node was the anchor point of the day, silencing, the original instrument of the wrong. She hesitated before it for a long moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood what she was about to do, and she wanted to be fully present for it. Then she separated it, cleanly. the way she did everything when she had taken the time to understand it properly, and the last of the SEAL's network collapsed. Cale Voss stood up. He did it slowly, with the deliberateness of a person who has been seated for 800 years and is not going to give the moment less than it deserves. He stood to his full height, which was considerable, and the silver light of the chamber intensified around him, not in any dramatic magical display, but simply in the way that the presence of a primordial at full, unbound capacity changes the quality of the light in the room. The way a fire that has been banked for a very long time changes the quality of the air when it's finally allowed to breathe. He looked at the room, the warriors, Corvin, Helvik. He looked at the entrance, where the fading light of late afternoon was visible. Then he looked at Nara, who was sitting on the edge of the dais, because her legs had decided that they had contributed enough, and it was someone else's turn. "Thank you," he said, in Third Archaic, and then in the common tongue, because he understood that some things needed to be said in both. "You're welcome," she said. "Now please sit down before the power displacement makes you fall down, because I have done a very great deal of work today, and I would like it to be unembarrassing." Something happened in his face that was, unambiguously, a smile, not a small one. It was the smile of someone who has been serious for 800 years, encountering something that is genuinely, unexpectedly funny in the best possible way, and it transformed his face in a manner that she filed away carefully for later examination. He sat down on the edge of the dais beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence between them was not empty, but full. The way silence is between people who have just done something large together and are giving it the space it needs. Tell me what you're feeling right now in the comments, because this story has so much further to go, and I need to know if you're on this journey with me. The council's team arrived 36 hours later, not the 3 to 4 days Cale had estimated, which meant the council had moved faster than anticipated, and used a route that was not the standard one, which in turn meant they had been preparing for exactly this kind of contingency long before the expedition was sent. There were 12 of them, all high-ranked wolves with the bearing of people who were accustomed to arriving somewhere and finding that their presence constituted the end of any meaningful debate about outcomes. They were led by a woman named Solon Vielle, who held the title of council executor and who had the kind of absolute certainty in her own authority that belongs to people who have never, in living memory, had that authority genuinely challenged. She had never met Nara Ashvale or Cale Voss, and this was the fundamental miscalculation of her entire career. The situation she arrived to was not the one she had been briefed on. The briefing had described a sealed chamber, a bloodline key, a partially conscious primordial in a weakened state, and a containment operation. What she found was an open chamber with no active seal, a small cluster of shell-shocked warriors in a loose grouping that bore no resemblance to the containment formation they were supposed to be maintaining. A clan scribe sitting against the wall with 8 filled notebooks who stood up when she entered and said, clearly and without nervousness, "Everything in this chamber has been documented in triplicate, and copies have been sent to 3 independent archivists via secure courier. I would suggest you take that into consideration." Helvik, Nara thought, from her position near the dais, had made his decision about what role he was going to play. Solon Vielle's gaze moved past him to Nara, and then, with the quality of gaze adjustment that very powerful people make when they realize they are in the presence of something they had not correctly categorized, to Cale, who was standing. He had spent the previous day in the recovery process he had described, which had not been dramatic from the outside, but had clearly been significant from the inside. And now he stood with the particular quality of a person who has reclaimed something that was owed to them and is in no hurry to explain himself to anyone. "Executor Vielle," Kyle said, in the common tongue, with the cadence of a man who had spent 8 centuries arranging what he wanted to say. "You are here on behalf of a council that has been operating on the basis of a historical falsification for 800 years. I am going to describe that falsification to you now, in complete detail. And I want you to understand that I am doing so not as a negotiation, but as a matter of record. Everything I say will be consistent with the documentation your colleague has been producing." He glanced at Helvik. And with the secondary texts that have been in the Ashvale archive for 300 years, and with the information that has been sent to the independent archivists. He paused. You may, of course, attempt to challenge this. I would encourage you to think carefully about whether that serves any purpose beyond delay. Solon Vielle was a woman of genuine intelligence, which was, in this moment, more of a disadvantage than an asset, because intelligent people are capable of accurately assessing situations in which less intelligent people might simply act. She assessed this one, and she understood it, and the understanding moved across her face, with the quality of someone revising a very large number of assumptions simultaneously. She said, "This is not over." "No," Cale agreed. "It is not. It is, however, beginning in a way that cannot be undone. I believe that distinction matters." Solon Vielle looked at Nara. Nara held the look with the steadiness that 24 years of invisibility had given her, the steadiness of someone who has nothing to perform, because she has never been performing anything. "The bloodline," Solon Vielle said. Not really to Nara, but to the air, to the space where her understanding had just been revised. "Yes," Nara said. "We thought it was gone. You ensured it was hidden," Nara said. "There is a difference. Helvik can show you the documentation on that specific point, if you want the chapter and verse." Solon Vielle looked at Cale, at the chamber that had been opened, at the seal that was no longer in place, at the light still blazing in the floor channels from Nara's footprints. She was a woman who had built her entire career on the architecture of a lie so old that it had become institutional truth. And she was, watching that architecture develop cracks in real time. And she was smart enough to know that the question was no longer whether it would fall, but whether she would be standing under it when it did. She chose not to be standing under it. It was not a noble choice, it was a practical one. But practical choices made at the right moment sometimes produce the same outcomes as noble ones. "What do you want?" she asked. "A formal convening of the full interclan assembly," Kyle said. "Not the council. The assembly. Every clan head withstanding, in the same place, with full access to the documentation that has been compiled. 30 days from today. 30 days is not enough time to organize a full assembly." "In that case," Kyle said, with the patience of a man for whom 30 days is essentially nothing, "I suggest you start immediately." The council's team left the chamber before nightfall, not in defeat exactly, because the situation was too complex for something as simple as defeat, but in the particular withdrawal of people who have realized that the ground has shifted and they need to understand the new terrain before they can navigate it. Corvin's warriors remained, having made their own collective decision about which side of the historical record they wanted to be on, a decision that Corvin himself had been the last to make, but had made with the full commitment of a man who had been lied to and was angry about it, rather than motivated by personal advantage. When the chamber was quiet, Nara sat down on the steps of the dais and looked at the documents she had spread around her during the work, and thought about the fact that she had come here as a disposable key, and was leaving as something she did not yet have a name for. Kyle sat beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, which was itself a strange thing. The warmth of a person who had been sealed in stone, and was now simply present in the room, generating the ordinary heat of a living body. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "I'm cataloging." "You are always cataloging." "Yes," she said, without apology. He was quiet for a moment. "The assembly will not be easy, even with the documentation. People resist revision of what they have believed to be true for generations. I know. The council families will not simply accept the findings. There will be political maneuvering, challenges to the authenticity of the secondary texts, attempts to discredit the archivists. I know that too. You are not alarmed by this." "I am," she said. "I have simply learned that being alarmed and being functional are not mutually exclusive, and that one of them is more useful than the other." She looked at him. "You spent 800 years being perfectly clear about what had been done to you, and what needed to be done about it, with no ability to act on any of it. That seems to me the harder situation." "It was," he said. It was made less impossible by the belief that eventually someone would come. Did you know it would be someone like me? He considered this with the deliberateness she had come to recognize as intrinsic to him. The quality of a person who does not say things carelessly, because he knows what it costs when words are taken out of context and used as weapons. The texts that describe the bloodline are not specific about the individual, he said. They describe capacity and lineage. They do not describe character. He looked at her, in the steady, silver-lit way that she had been filing away for examination. I did not know it would be someone who came prepared, who had spent 7 years reading and preserving and building a case, who brought a scribe, a pause, who made me laugh within the first day. The bar for what counts as making you laugh was probably quite low after 8 centuries, she said. Perhaps, he said. I find that the standard does not diminish the result. She looked at him for a long moment. This man, who had been beautiful and worn and silver-eyed and patient, in a way that ran all the way down to whatever a person is made of beneath the bone, and she thought about 7 years of reading about him in a dim archive room, and 24 years of being invisible, and the strange vertiginous quality of arriving at a place you have been moving toward without knowing you were moving. She thought about how the secondary texts had described the bloodline bond in terms she had always read as historical and was now understanding might have other dimensions. The texts described the bloodline's connection to the primordial bloodline as a bond, she said carefully. Not in the mate bond sense, in a more specific sense. Yes, he said, equally carefully. They describe it as a recognition, a mutual one. Yes. And when you spoke my name, the first word you said, you used the third archaic root that means recognition. Yes. She held this. I need you to understand, she said, that I have spent my entire life in a clan that treated me as a burden, and I have very limited experience with being in situations where I am recognized as anything other than a tool or an inconvenience, and I am going to need whatever this is to move at a pace that my nervous system can process. He held her gaze steadily. I have been waiting for 800 years, he said. I am, I believe, capable of patience. I'm not asking you to wait indefinitely, she said, because she was, even now, precise in her use of language. I'm asking you to let me get there myself. That, he said, with the warmth that she was learning to read beneath the spare and careful surface of him, is the only way I would ever want you to arrive anywhere. She looked away before the thing in her chest could make her eyes do something that she wasn't ready to examine yet. She looked at her documents. She looked at the walls still covered in inscriptions. She hadn't had time to read. She thought about 30 days and an assembly, and a truth that had been waiting 800 years for the right person to find it. Get some sleep, she said. We have a great deal of work to do tomorrow. We, he said, with a weight that was not possessive, but was something she felt in her sternum all the same. Yes, she said. We. And if you are not fully invested in this story right now, I don't know what to tell you, because what comes next is the part where Nara Ashvile and Kyle Voss walk into the full interclan assembly and proceed to remake the world, and I need you to be subscribed and have that notification bell on, because you are not going to want to miss a single moment of it. The 30 days before the assembly were the most consequential of Nara's life, and also, she would later reflect, the period during which she most fully understood what it meant to be in partnership with someone, as distinct from being in proximity with them, or being used by them, or being invisible to them. She and Kale worked together from the morning after the council's team departed, establishing a rhythm that built on the shorthand they had already developed in the chamber, and expanded it into something that encompassed the full scope of what they were trying to do. She organized the documentation. It was a task that suited her with a precision that occasionally made Kale stop and watch her with an expression she was learning to read as a particular form of admiration. The admiration of a person who recognizes excellence in a domain they understand well enough to accurately assess. She categorized the secondary texts by chronological period and cross-referenced them against the wall inscriptions she had been copying in the days following the seal's removal, building an evidentiary structure that would withstand the kind of challenge she knew was coming. Rigorous, complete, indexed in a way that allowed any specific claim to be traced to its primary source with a single reference. He provided context that no document could provide, the first-hand account of a witness who had been there, who had seen what had been done and by whom, whose memory was 8 centuries old and perfectly intact because the seal had preserved him as completely as it had contained him. He spoke for hours at a time, in the careful, organized way of someone who has been arranging testimony in his head for longer than most civilizations last. And she recorded it all, asking questions that sharpened the account and caught the places where certainty ended and inference began, because she understood that the most powerful documentation is not the most dramatic, but the most precise. Helvig, who had been working through the night for 3 days straight to complete his transcription of the chamber inscriptions, presented her with 8 notebooks on the 4th morning, his expression carrying the complex mixture of professional pride and personal discomfort that belonged to a man who was accepting that the most important work of his life had required him to also accept that he had been wrong about a great many things for a great many years. She thanked him without ceremony, because she understood that ceremony would embarrass him, and she incorporated his transcriptions into the master document, and the combination of what he had copied and what she had copied and what Cale had provided gave her something that was, for the first time in 800 years, a complete account. The assembly convened 28 days after Solon Vile's withdrawal from the chamber, 2 days ahead of the demanded deadline, which was itself a signal about how quickly the council families had understood that the situation required management rather than suppression. 43 clan heads arrived at the neutral ground in the valley called the Ashvale Flats, a flat expanse of highland meadow that had served as interclan meeting ground for generations, surrounded by the silver-peaked mountains. On 3 sides and the sky on the 4th, 43 clan heads and their senior advisors and their own archivists, and, in 3 cases, their own translators of the old lunar scripts, summoned in the preceding weeks by communiques that had described what was coming with enough specificity that it was no longer possible to claim ignorance of the subject matter. Nara had never been to an interclan assembly. She had read about them. The reality was larger and louder than the text conveyed. A gathering of people who carried power in their bodies and wore it in the way they moved, the kind of collective presence that she could feel even without the pack bond, a weight of massed attention that pressed against her like physical force. She stood at the edge of the assembly ground while the clan heads arranged themselves in the traditional semicircle, and she felt, for the first time in her life, genuinely visible, not in the warm sense, not yet, but in the way that a thing becomes. Visible when it is about to become undeniable. Kyle stood beside her. He had not changed, in the 30 days since his release, in any fundamental way. He was still spare, and careful, and patient and precise, and the silver in his eyes had not diminished. But he was present in the world in a way that he had not been in the chamber, the way a person is present when they are standing in the open air rather than sealed in stone. And the quality of his presence was something that the assembled wolves registered before they registered anything else. A physical awareness that moved through the gathering like a current, something very old and very large orienting in their direction. She said quietly, "Are you ready?" "I have been ready for 800 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I meant for the next 2 hours." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that she had filed away for examination, and had since examined and understood, and had opinions about. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She thought about 24 years and archive rooms and a chest of sealed documents and the 3rd archaic root of a name that meant recognition. "Yes," she said. They walked into the assembly together. The testimony lasted 4 hours rather than 2, because the documentation was more extensive than even Nara had anticipated when she had estimated the presentation time, and because Cale's first-hand account drew questions from the assembled clan heads that were substantive rather than procedural, the questions of people who were genuinely revising their understanding of their own history in real time, and needed to follow the revisions to their conclusions. The 5 council family representatives attempted 4 separate challenges to the documentation's authenticity, and lost each one when Helvig, who had positioned himself on Nara's left with his 8 notebooks and 6 additional reference texts, produced the relevant counter-documentation with the efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this contingency. The council representatives tried a fifth approach, which was not a challenge to the documentation, but a challenge to the standing of the witnesses, questioning whether a dormant shifter with no formal clan rank had the authority to present primary documentation at an interclan assembly, and whether a person who had been sealed by collective decision 8 centuries ago had the standing to offer testimony about that decision. It was the last card they had to play, and it had the quality of a card that had been designed for a different game. 43 clan heads heard it. 43 clan heads looked at the documentation and at Helvik's notebooks and at the expressions on the faces of Corvin's warriors who had been present in the chamber and who were present now, and at Kale Voss standing with 8 centuries of enforced patience and the ability to look any of them in the eye and give the exact same answer every time, regardless of how the question was framed, which is the quality that only belongs to people who are telling the truth. And 43 clan heads, one by one, in the order of formal assembly procedure, indicated standing for the witnesses. It was not unanimous. 38 of 43. 5 abstentions from the clans most closely tied to the council families, none of whom were willing to actively oppose the record, but none of whom were yet willing to fully commit to the revision. Nara noted them without judgment. She had expected something like this. Political change of this magnitude does not happen in one assembly, and she had never expected it to. What she had expected was a beginning, and that was what she got. The formal resolution passed by the assembly stripped the council families of their authority to act unilaterally on behalf of the interclan body, required a full audit of the historical record by an independent panel of archivists that included Helvik, established a temporary governance committee drawn from the full assembly rather than the existing council structure, and mandated a second assembly within 90 days to review the audit findings and establish a permanent new governance framework. It was not a revolution. It was, in the language of institutional change, a controlled demolition of a structure that could not continue to stand, and the beginning of the architecture of a replacement. Nara had spent 7 years building toward a moment that she had not known would look like this, and when it was over, when the resolution was recorded, and the assembly was formally closed, and the clan heads were dispersing into the late afternoon light, she stood on the assembly ground and felt the particular quality of tiredness that belongs to the completion of something very large. Kyle stood beside her and said nothing, because he understood that the moment did not need words. She said, eventually, "It's not over." "No." He agreed. The 5 abstentions will be 3 by the second assembly, and 2 will never move. The audit will be challenged at the margins. The new governance framework will need to be built carefully, or the same patterns will re-emerge in different forms. "Yes, I'm going to need to stay involved," she said. "I don't know what that looks like institutionally yet. Helvik will be part of the audit panel. But the ongoing work, the archival work, the translation work, the documentation of the reconstruction, that will take years. I know," he said. "I intend to be part of it." She looked at him. "You don't have to," she said. "You have been held against your will for 800 years. You are free now. That should mean something." "It does mean something," he said. "It means I can choose where I am and what I do with the time I have." He looked at her steadily. "I choose this work. I choose it because it matters, and because it is necessary, and because the person doing it is someone I want to be in the same room with." He paused. "I am, as promised, giving you space to get there yourself, but I will not pretend that I do not know where I am." She held his gaze for a long moment, in which the assembly ground emptied around them, and the mountains went silver in the last of the day's light, and the sky above the Veyrath range was the particular shade of deep blue that comes just before the stars. She thought about recognition, and about bloodlines, and about the difference between destiny and choice, and about how the best version of a thing that was meant to happen was always the version that was chosen freely, rather than compelled. "I know where I am too," she said. It was not a declaration of anything except the truth, and the truth was enough, and it had always been enough if the person hearing it had the patience to understand it, He had the patience. There is a particular kind of ending that is not really an ending at all, but a door. The point at which one story has been completed and another has been made possible. This is that point. The white wolf had been legend, had been sealed, had been silenced, had been waiting. The woman who found him had been invisible, had been dormant, had been overlooked, had been carrying a 7-year-old copy of the truth in her pack, alongside preservation cloths and stable flame lanterns, and they had each been exactly what the other needed, in the precise way that does not require magic to explain, though there was magic in it, and it was real. And if you want to hear what happens next, what the Second Assembly produces, and what the new governance framework looks like, and what Nara Ashvale's title is in the historical record that gets written about this period, and whether she ever stops cataloging long enough to let herself have the thing she has known she wants since the first night in the chamber, then you know what to do. Subscribe. Turn on the notification bell. Leave me a comment that tells me which moment in this story hit you the hardest, because I will read every single one of them, and because the next chapter is already written, and I am ready to tell it. Epilogue. 3 years after the assembly at the Ashvale Flats, the new interclan governance structure had been formally ratified by 41 of the 43 clans, the 2 holdouts having been reduced to observer status pending a review that everyone understood would eventually conclude in the same direction. The historical record had been reconstructed, the audit completed, the council family authority dismantled and replaced by a rotating governance body in which every clan had proportional representation. The secondary texts, formally designated as primary historical documents, were housed in a newly established archive at the Ashvale Flats, in a building that had been purpose-built for them, staffed by a team of archivists that Helvik had personally trained, and who worked under the title that Nara had proposed and that had been formally adopted by the governance body. Keepers of the true record. Helvik himself held the senior keeper position and had aged approximately a decade in terms of professional fulfillment in the 3 years since the chamber, having found in the reconstruction of the historical record the work that he had been, in his overcrowded, resentful way, always trying to do. Nara held the title of primary archivist and special advisor to the Governance Assembly, which was the formal designation for a role that was in practice much more expansive than the title suggested. She sat on the Documentation Review Committee, the Governance Framework Oversight Body, and the Interclan Dispute Resolution Panel, and she also spent 4 days a week in the archive building reading things that needed to be read and writing things that needed to be written, which was her version of happiness, and she made no apologies for it. Kale held no formal title and needed none. He held the informal, one that the clan heads had arrived at collectively over the course of 2 years of working with him, which was simply the witness, and it carried the weight of its accuracy. He was the only living witness to the events that had shaped 800 years of interclan history, and his testimony was the foundation on which everything else had been built, and his presence in any room in which decisions were being made about the governance of that history had a quality that did not require formal designation to be felt and understood. He and Nara lived in the building adjacent to the archive, a choice that had been practical before it became personal, and had been personal for a very long time, before either of them said so in as many words. She had gotten there herself, in the end, in her own time, which had been what she'd asked for, and he had been there when she arrived, which had been what he'd promised, and the thing between them had the quality of everything they built. Careful, specific, built to last, and founded entirely on the premise that seeing someone clearly, without the distortion of what you want them to be, or what is convenient for them to be, is both the beginning and the continuation of everything that matters. On the 3rd anniversary of the assembly, standing on the Ashvale Flats in the late afternoon light, with the silver mountains around them and the completed archive building at their backs, Nara said, "The governance body wants to commission a formal history, comprehensive, the reconstruction, the assembly, the new framework, a document for all the clans." "Yes," Kale said. "I told them I would write it." He looked at her. "Of course you did." "I told them it would take 3 years. That is probably accurate." "I told them," she said. carefully, in the voice she used for things that mattered precisely as much as she said they mattered, and not more and not less, that I would be writing it with a co-author. The silver in his eyes was warm in the late light, the particular warmth that she had been cataloging for 3 years and had filled more than one private notebook with, the warmth of something very old and very patient that had found its reason to be neither. I would be honored, he said. It will not be a romantic history, she said. It will be rigorous and documented and properly cited, naturally. The personal material will be in the appendix at most, where it belongs, he said, with the warmth that she had never quite learned to look directly at, without the thing in her chest doing what it did, unless the record requires otherwise. She looked at him, this man who had been legend and seal and silenced and waiting, who had waited for her specifically without knowing her specifically, who had been patient as stone and then as still water, and was now as present as the light. And she thought about all the things she had filed away for examination over 3 years, and had examined fully, and had arrived at conclusions about, and she said, in third archaic, the word that meant recognition. He said it back. And somewhere in the archive building behind them, in the section reserved for primary documents of the Reconstruction era, the secondary texts rested in their preservation casings, no longer hidden, no longer feared, no longer buried beneath a story designed to silence them. They told the truth, as they always had, as they had been waiting to do for 800 years, which was, in the end, all they had ever wanted. The truth, it turned out, was very patient. It had simply needed someone to come and read it, and now it was read,